To the rigid, hyper-masculine courts of 20th century Europe, he was nothing more than a grotesque joke, a pervert, whispered about behind fans and champagne glasses. They called him the Queen of the Balkans, a title dripping with venomous homophobia. He was a monarch who preferred the delicate petals of a rare orchid to the cold steel of a rifle, and who looked upon his handsome blonde aides-de-camp with a longing that was considered a mortal sin. He was the ultimate outcast, a man forced to hide his true nature behind layers of face powder, heavy perfume, and flamboyant jewelry, living as a forbidden soul in a world that demanded he be a warrior. Yet history has delivered a stunning paradox. The very hands that were mocked for being too soft and manicured ended up forging a modern nation out of mud and chaos. And in 2024, the man who died in lonely exile, shunned by the world for his unnatural ways, returned to his capital not as a pariah, but as a revered ancestor, receiving a solemn state burial that few traditional kings ever achieved. This is the tragedy of Ferdinand I of Bulgaria. Was he merely a failed man, born in the wrong body in the wrong century? Or was his flamboyant eccentricity actually a brilliant mask, used to hide a razor-sharp ambition that terrified the greatest empires on earth? How did this happen? How did a butterfly-collecting Austrian aristocrat end up on the wildest, most dangerous throne in Europe? To understand the tragedy of Ferdinand, we cannot start with the war. We must start with the silence of a gilded cage in Vienna and a mother who refused to let her son be ordinary. Ferdinand Maximilian, Karl Leopold Maria, was born on February 26, 1861, in the Palais Coburg in Vienna. To say he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth would be an insult. He was born with a diamond-encrusted ladle. He belonged to the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a family often jokingly referred to as the stud farm of Europe. They were the royal family's favorite breeding stock. If a country needed a king or a queen needed a consort, they rang the Coburgs. Queen Victoria's beloved husband Albert was a Coburg. The King of Portugal was a Coburg. The King of the Belgians was a Coburg. They were everywhere, a vast transnational corporation of monarchy. But Ferdinand was born into a secondary branch. He was the youngest son of the youngest son. In the brutal calculus of royal succession, he was irrelevant. He was spare parts. His father, Prince Auguste, was a pleasant but unremarkable man who had no great ambitions and left little impression on history. His mother, however, was a force of nature. Princess Clémentine of Orléans was the daughter of Louis-Philippe I, the last king of France. She was a woman of terrifying intellect, immense wealth, and a bitterness that ran as deep as the Danube. She had seen her father lose his throne in the Revolution of 1848. She had seen her family exiled. She carried within her the burning, unfulfilled ambition of a dynasty interrupted. She was deaf, but she heard everything that mattered, and she decided with a cold iron will that if she could not be a queen, she would be the mother of kings. Young Ferdinand was her masterpiece. From the moment he could walk, Clémentine realized that her youngest son was different. His brothers, Philip and August, were typical boys, rough, interested in horses, hunting, and soldiers. They fit the mold. Ferdinand did not. He was a strange, solitary child. While other boys played with tin soldiers, Ferdinand was in the garden, staring at the petals of a rose for hours. He was obsessed with beauty. He collected insects not to pull their wings off, but to marvel at their iridescence. He categorized plants with the rigor of a university professor before he was 10 years old. He loved soft fabrics, bright colors, and the sparkle of gemstones. In the hyper-masculine culture of the Austrian court, this was dangerous. The court of Emperor Franz Joseph was a place of stiff uniforms, waxed mustaches, and rigid protocol. A boy who preferred botany to bayonets was viewed with deep suspicion. He was bullied mercilessly. His peers mocked his large hooked nose, his soft voice, and his reluctance to engage in roughhousing. They called him names that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But Clementine did not try to beat the softness out of him. Instead, she weaponized it. She saw in Ferdinand a superior intellect. She realized that his sensitivity made him observant. While the other boys were hitting each other with sticks, Ferdinand was watching, analyzing, and remembering. She nurtured his mind. She hired the best tutors in Europe. She took him on grand tours, teaching him the subtle languages of diplomacy, art, and manipulation. Ferdinand grew into a young man of immense paradox. He was undeniably effeminate in his mannerisms. He walked with a mincing gait, he wore bracelets, and he bathed in perfumes that left a heavy floral trail wherever he went. But behind those heavy-lidded eyes lay a razor-sharp brain. He learned to use his eccentricity as a shield. If people thought he was just a harmless, frivolous dandy, they wouldn't see the knife he was hiding in his sleeve. He was a strange, solitary child. While other boys played with tin soldiers, Ferdinand was in the garden, staring at the petals of a rose for hours. He was obsessed with beauty. He collected insects not to pull their wings off, but to marvel at their iridescence. He categorized plants with the rigor of a university professor before he was 10 years old. He loved soft fabrics, bright colors, and the sparkle of gemstones. In the hyper-masculine culture of the Austrian court, this was dangerous. The court of Emperor Franz Joseph was a place of stiff uniforms, waxed mustaches, and rigid protocol. A boy who preferred botany to bayonets was viewed with deep suspicion. He was bullied mercilessly. His peers mocked his large hooked nose, his soft voice, and his reluctance to engage in roughhousing. They called him names that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But Clementine did not try to beat the softness out of him. Instead, she weaponized it. She saw in Ferdinand a superior intellect. She realized that his sensitivity made him observant. While the other boys were hitting each other with sticks, Ferdinand was watching, analyzing, and remembering. She nurtured his mind. She hired the best tutors in Europe. She took him on grand tours, teaching him the subtle languages of diplomacy, art, and manipulation. Ferdinand grew into a young man of immense paradox. He was undeniably effeminate in his mannerisms. He walked with a mincing gait, he wore bracelets, and he bathed in perfumes that left a heavy floral trail wherever he went. But behind those heavy-lidded eyes lay a razor-sharp brain. He learned to use his eccentricity as a shield. If people thought he was just a harmless, frivolous dandy, they wouldn't see the knife he was hiding in his sleeve. By his early 20s, Ferdinand was a fixture in Viennese high society, but he was a bored one. He was a lieutenant in the Austrian army, a role he loathed. He hated the barracks, the dirt, and the stupidity of military life. He spent his time adding to his vast collection of birds and butterflies, waiting for a destiny that seemed unlikely to ever arrive. He was the impossible prince, too royal to work, too eccentric to be given real responsibility, and too ambitious to be happy. And then, in 1886, a crisis in a rugged mountainous land to the east blew the door of his golden cage wide open. To understand why Ferdinand ended up in Bulgaria, we have to understand what Bulgaria was in 1886. To the refined aristocrats of Vienna or London, Bulgaria was barely a concept. It was a dark, dangerous hinterland on the edge of the map, a place of wolves, mountains, and bandits. For 500 years, Bulgaria had been a province of the Ottoman Empire. It had been erased from history, its culture suppressed, its people heavily taxed. But in the late 19th century, the Ottoman grip weakened. After the bloody Russo-Turkish War of 1877, Bulgaria was reestablished as an autonomous principality. It wasn't fully independent. It was technically a vassal of the Sultan, but it had its own government and its own prince. The first prince was Alexander of Battenberg, a handsome, dashing nephew of the Russian Tsar. The Bulgarians loved him. He was a war hero. But he made a fatal mistake. He tried to be independent. The Russian Empire didn't liberate Bulgaria out of charity. They did it because they wanted a puppet state in the Balkans, a stepping stone to Constantinople. When Battenberg refused to be a Russian puppet, the Tsar was furious. In August 1886, a group of pro-Russian officers broke into the palace in Sofia in the dead of night. They dragged Prince Alexander out of his bed at gunpoint, forced him to sign his abdication, and kidnapped him. It was a scene straight out of a cheap thriller. They bundled the prince onto a boat down the Danube and dumped him on foreign soil. Although loyal forces staged a counter-coup and invited Alexander back, the prince was broken. The Tsar of Russia, Alexander III, made it clear that he would never approve of Battenberg's rule. Broken-hearted, Alexander abdicated for good and left the country. Bulgaria was plunged into chaos. The country was leaderless. The Russian bear was growling at the border, threatening to invade and turn Bulgaria into a Russian province. The other great powers, Britain, Austria, Germany, were watching nervously, terrified that a war in the Balkans would drag them all in. A regency council was formed to run the country, led by a man named Stefan Stambolov. Remember that name, for he is the other protagonist in this tragedy. Stambolov was the son of an innkeeper. He was short, stocky, and had a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He was a revolutionary fighter, a poet, and a ruthless pragmatist. He was the Bismarck of the Balkans. Stambolov knew that Bulgaria needed a prince and fast. Without a monarch, the country had no legitimacy in the eyes of Europe. It was just a rebellious province waiting to be crushed. So he sent a delegation of 3 desperate men on a tour of Europe with a simple mission: find us a king. It sounds like a fairy tale, but it was a humiliation. The delegation traveled from capital to capital, hat in hand, begging noblemen to take their crown. "Please?" they asked the Duke of Edinburgh. "No," came the reply. "How about you?" they asked a Danish prince. "Absolutely not," was the answer. They asked the King of Romania. He laughed in their faces. Why? Because the Bulgarian throne was widely considered a death sentence. Everyone knew that whoever sat on it would be a target for Russian assassins. It was an unstable, muddy, primitive country with a history of kidnapping its own rulers. To accept the Bulgarian throne was considered a form of suicide. The newspapers in London and Paris mocked the beggar delegation, running cartoons of the Bulgarians wandering the streets, trying to give a crown to random passers-by. The delegation was in Vienna, sitting in a smoky beer hall, exhausted and humiliated. They were about to give up. They had run out of names. And then a minor Austrian major, who knew the scene, leaned over and whispered a name. "Have you thought of the Coburg, Prince Ferdinand?" The Bulgarians stared at him. "Who?" "Ferdinand, the one who catches butterflies. He's rich, he's royal, and, well, he's bored." It was the longest of long shots, but beggars cannot be choosers. The delegation adjusted their coats, finished their beers, and went to the Palais Coburg. When the Bulgarian delegates arrived at the Coburg Palace, they were overwhelmed by the luxury. This was a world of velvet curtains, gold leaf, and hushed servants. It was the antithesis of the rough wooden world of Sofia. They met Ferdinand. One can only imagine the scene. 3 rough-hewn Balkan politicians smelling of tobacco and road dust. standing before this 26-year-old aesthete with his perfumed handkerchief and his manicured nails. Ferdinand listened to them with a languid, almost bored expression. But sitting next to him was Princess Clementine, and her eyes were burning. The delegates explained the situation. They didn't lie. They told him it was dangerous. They told him Russia would be furious. They told him the country was poor. Ferdinand looked at them. He saw the danger, yes, but his mother saw the opportunity. This was it, the chance to be a king, the chance to step out of the shadows of his brothers, to show the world that the effeminate boy was made of sterner stuff. Ferdinand famously said, "I will accept, provided the great powers approve." It was a polite way of saying maybe. He knew the great powers would never approve. Russia would veto any candidate who wasn't their puppet. But Clementine went to work. She poured her fortune into the project. She bribed journalists to write favorable articles about her son. She lobbied diplomats. She whispered in Ferdinand's ear day and night, "You are destined for this. Do not let them frighten you. You have the blood of kings." Slowly, Ferdinand's fear turned into fascination. The Byzantine idea began to take root in his mind. Bulgaria wasn't just a muddy backwater. It was the doorstep to the Orient. It was the ancient land of Thrace. It was close to Constantinople. If he could civilize this wild nation, he would be the greatest monarch of his age. But the reaction from Europe was savage. When news leaked that Ferdinand was considering the offer, Queen Victoria, his own father's cousin, wrote a scathing letter. She called him totally unfit, delicate, eccentric, and effeminate. She warned that he would be murdered within a month. The Tsar of Russia, Alexander III, called him the Prince of the Fleas. The German Chancellor Bismarck, the most powerful man in Europe, simply shrugged and said, "Let him go. It will be a distinct relief to have him out of Vienna." The consensus was clear. Ferdinand was a joke. A queen trying to play king in a land of wolves. This universal mockery did something unexpected. It triggered Ferdinand's pride. He was a narcissist, deeply sensitive to insult. The fact that they all thought he would fail made him want to do it. He wanted to prove them wrong. He wanted to show the old biddy Victoria and the boorish Russian Tsar that the butterfly hunter had teeth. In July 1887, without the approval of the great powers, without the blessing of Russia, and against the advice of almost everyone except his mother, Ferdinand formally accepted the throne. He resigned his commission in the Austrian army. He packed his bags, trunks filled with silk underwear, microscopes, taxidermy equipment, and enough jewelry to sink a small ship. He boarded a steamer on the Danube. He was sailing into the unknown. The journey down the Danube was a transition between worlds. As the steamer moved east, the orderly, manicured landscape of Central Europe gave way to something wilder. The architecture changed from Baroque to Ottoman. The church spires turned into minarets. The green hills turned into rugged, sun-scorched mountains. Ferdinand stood on the deck watching his new kingdom approach. He was terrified. He was prone to panic attacks, and the reality of what he had done was sinking in. He was going to a country where he didn't speak the language, didn't know the customs, and where half the population probably wanted to kill him. When the boat docked at the Bulgarian port of Vidin, the contrast was shocking. Ferdinand stepped off the boat in a pristine Austrian general's uniform, his chest glittering with orders, his mustache waxed to perfection. He was met by a crowd of peasants in sheepskin coats and wool hats, smelling of garlic and sweat. They cheered, but they also stared. They had never seen a man like this. He looked like a porcelain doll dropped into a mud puddle. Waiting for him was Stefan Stambolov. The meeting between Ferdinand and Stambulov is one of history's great odd couples. Stambulov was short, dark, and radiated a terrifying intensity. He looked at this tall, soft, perfumed prince with a mixture of hope and contempt. He needed Ferdinand to be the symbol of the state, but he had no intention of letting him rule. "Welcome to Bulgaria, Your Highness," Stambulov said. His voice was rough. He didn't bow quite as low as he should have. Ferdinand smiled that enigmatic, tight-lipped smile that would become his trademark. He extended a gloved hand. He knew instantly that this man was his rival. Stambulov was the master of this land. Ferdinand was the guest. The carriage ride to the capital, Sofia, was a rude awakening. There were no paved roads. The carriage bounced and rattled over ruts deep enough to swallow a wheel. Dust coated Ferdinand's pristine uniform. When they finally arrived in Sofia, Ferdinand looked out the window and gasped. "This is the capital," he whispered to his aide. Sofia in 1887 was essentially a large Turkish village. There were almost no brick buildings. The streets were made of mud. Pigs and chickens roamed freely in the main square. There was no electricity, no sewage system. The royal palace was a dilapidated former Turkish administrative building that smelled of damp and old cooking oil. It was infested with rats. For a man who had grown up in the Rococo splendor of Vienna, it was a nightmare. He had traded the Palais Coburg for a rat-infested shack in a mud pit. But as he stepped out of the carriage, Ferdinand did something remarkable. He didn't recoil. He didn't cover his nose. He stood tall, ignored the mud splashing onto his polished boots, and waved to the crowd. He spoke his first words in broken Bulgarian, a phrase he had practiced for days. "People of Bulgaria," he cried out, his voice high and reedy, but surprisingly projected. "I have come to give my life for your freedom." The crowd went wild. They didn't care about his perfume or his nose. They saw a prince who had defied the Russian Tsar to be with them. They saw a symbol of their own independence. That night in the drafty, miserable palace, Ferdinand wrote a letter to his mother. "It is filthy," he wrote. "It is savage. The food is inedible, and the people look at me as if I were a zoo animal. But, Maman, they cheered. They really cheered." He was the Prince of the Mud now. But Ferdinand had no intention of remaining a prince of the mud. He looked at the squalor of Sofia and didn't see what was there. He saw what could be there. He would turn this pigsty into a new Vienna. He would turn these sheepskin-clad peasants into a Prussian-style army, and he would turn himself into an emperor. But first he had to survive Stambulov. The Bismarck of the Balkans had put Ferdinand on the throne, but he kept the prince on a very short leash. Stambulov treated Ferdinand like a naughty child, censoring his mail, controlling his budget, and isolating him from the army. "He thinks I am a puppet," Ferdinand muttered to his only friend, his French secretary. He was pacing his room, rearranging his collection of semi-precious stones to calm his nerves. "He thinks because I like flowers, I have no thorns. He is wrong." The stage was set for a deadly psychological duel. On one side, the brutal, violent dictator who controlled the guns and the police. On the other, the effeminate, neurotic prince who had nothing but his mother's money and his own devious intellect. Most of Europe bet that Stambulov would crush the fop within a year. They bet that Ferdinand would be on a train back to Vienna, crying into his silk handkerchief before the winter snows melted. They were wrong. They didn't know that Ferdinand was not a butterfly. He was a spider, and he was just beginning to spin his web. The honeymoon period, if one could even call it that, between the orchid-loving prince and his rough-hewn subjects did not last long. By 1888, the reality of Ferdinand's position had settled in like a cold, damp fog over the muddy streets of Sofia. He was the Prince of Bulgaria, yes, but he was a prince in chains. The man holding the leash was Stefan Stambolov. History has rarely produced a political partnership so toxic, so filled with mutual loathing, and yet so undeniably effective. Stambolov was the Bulgarian Bismarck, a man who believed that the end justified the means, and the means usually involved bludgeons, secret police, and execution squads. He was a man of the earth, gruff, violent, and utterly fearless. He viewed Ferdinand not as a ruler, but as a shiny ornament to be placed on the hood of the state machine he was driving. For Ferdinand, a man of exquisite sensitivity who fainted at the sight of blood and could spend hours debating the shade of a velvet curtain, Stambolov was a living nightmare. The prime minister controlled everything. He opened Ferdinand's personal mail. He dictated who the prince could see. He controlled the budget, forcing Ferdinand to beg for funds to maintain his household. There is a famous anecdote from this period that encapsulates their relationship. One day, Ferdinand, in a rare attempt to assert authority, criticized a military appointment Stambolov had made. Stambolov turned on him, his face purple with rage, and slammed his fist onto the royal desk, scattering Ferdinand's precious, semi-precious stones. "Your Highness," Stambolov roared, "you must understand that without me, the Russians would have had you for breakfast long ago. You are the prince because I keep you the prince." Ferdinand said nothing. He simply sat there, pale and trembling, smoothing the wrinkles in his coat. He took the abuse. He swallowed the humiliation. To the outside world, he was a weakling, a puppet dancing on Stambolov's strings. But Ferdinand was playing the long game. He knew that Stambolov's brutality was making enemies. Every time Stambolov jailed a journalist, tortured a political opponent, or rigged an election, he was creating a reservoir of hatred. Ferdinand decided to be the vessel into which that hatred would eventually pour. He would be the good czar, waiting to save his people from the bad minister. But to do that, he first had to secure his dynasty. He needed a wife and he needed an heir. In the royal courts of 19th century Europe, marriage was not a matter of heart. It was a matter of biology and diplomacy. For Ferdinand, it was a chore, distasteful but necessary, like visiting the dentist. His sexuality was already the subject of whispers, and he had no natural inclination toward women. But the stability of the throne required a son. His mother, Princess Clementine, once again took charge. She scoured the Gotha Almanac, the directory of European royalty, looking for a princess willing to marry the Prince of the Mud. It was a hard sell. Bulgaria was still considered dangerous and semi-barbaric. Finally, she found a candidate, Princess Marie-Louise of Bourbon-Parma. Marie-Louise was Italian, devoutly Catholic, and painfully shy. She was 24 years old, with a long, melancholic face and a nature too gentle for the shark tank of Bulgarian politics. She was brought to Bulgaria like a lamb to the slaughter. The wedding took place in 1893 in Italy. It was a grand affair, but the groom seemed more interested in the floral arrangements than the bride. Ferdinand's treatment of Marie-Louise was cold, bordering on cruel. He found her intellectually dull and physically unappealing. He criticized her dress sense, mocked her shyness, and often ignored her for days, preferring the company of his handsome aides-de-camp. Yet, the marriage served its purpose. In January 1894, Marie-Louise gave birth to a son, Boris. The dynasty was secured. The cannons fired in Sofia, and the people cheered. But the birth of Boris brought a new explosive conflict that would finally shatter the relationship between Ferdinand and Stambolov. The conflict was religious. Ferdinand and Marie-Louise were Catholics. The Bulgarian constitution, however, stated that the heir to the throne must be Orthodox. But Ferdinand had promised the Pope, as a condition of the marriage, that his children would be raised Catholic. It was an impossible knot. Stambolov, surprisingly, sided with the Pope and the prince's promise, mostly because he wanted to keep Bulgaria oriented toward the West and away from Orthodox Russia. He didn't want a Russian-influenced czar, but Ferdinand saw an opportunity. He knew that to truly be accepted by his people and to get the Russian czar to finally recognize him, he would eventually have to baptize Boris as Orthodox. He began to hint to the Russian agents that he was willing to convert his son. He was signaling to the Tsar, "I am ready to be your friend if you help me get rid of Stambolov." By 1894, the atmosphere in Sofia was toxic. Stambolov had been in power for 7 years. His paranoia had grown. He saw conspiracies everywhere. His prisons were full. The Bulgarian people, who once hailed him as a protector, now feared him as a tyrant. Ferdinand sensed the shift in the wind. The fox sniffed the air and decided the time had come to bite. He began a campaign of passive aggression. He refused to sign Stambolov's decrees. He snubbed Stambolov's wife at social functions. He privately met with military officers who hated the prime minister. He cultivated the image of a refined liberal monarch who was being held hostage by a brute. Stambolov, arrogant to the end, thought he was indispensable. On May 29, 1894, he decided to play his usual card. He submitted his resignation letter to Ferdinand. He had done this many times before, a power move designed to force the prince to beg him to stay. He slammed the letter onto Ferdinand's desk. "If you think you can rule this country without me, Your Highness, go ahead and try." Ferdinand looked at the letter. He looked at Stambolov. For 7 years, he had lived in fear of this man, but now he saw a tired, hated dictator who had outlived his usefulness. Ferdinand picked up a pen. He didn't beg. He didn't panic. He simply wrote "accepted" at the bottom of the letter. Stambolov was stunned. He turned pale. He hadn't expected the fop to call his bluff. He stormed out of the palace, shouting threats. But as he stepped out onto the cobblestones, he found that the police, his police, were no longer saluting him with the same vigor. The army was silent. The crowds began to gather, not to protest his dismissal, but to celebrate it. The dictator had fallen. The prince was finally king in his own house. But Ferdinand knew that a wounded beast is the most dangerous. Stambolov was out of office, but he was still alive, still powerful, and furiously plotting his comeback. He gave interviews to foreign newspapers, revealing embarrassing secrets about Ferdinand's private life, hinting at the prince's unnatural affections and his cowardice. Ferdinand was terrified. As long as Stambolov lived, Ferdinand could never be safe. He could never reconcile with Russia, for Russia hated Stambolov. What happened next is a stain that Ferdinand could never wash off. On the evening of July 15, 1895, Stefan Stambolov was leaving the Union Club in Sofia. He climbed into an open carriage. As the carriage turned onto Rakovsky Street, 3 men jumped out of the shadows. They were Macedonian mercenaries, but everyone knew who held their leash. They didn't have guns. They had yatagans, long curved Ottoman knives. They attacked Stambolov with savage fury. Stambolov, a fighter to the end, tried to draw his revolver, but he was pinned down. Instinctively, he raised his hands to protect his head. The assassins hacked at his arms. In a gruesome frenzy, they severed both of Stambolov's hands almost completely. They slashed his head and face before fleeing into the night. Stambolov did not die immediately. He lay in the hospital for 3 days in agony. In his delirium, he didn't curse the assassins. He cursed Ferdinand. The Coburg has eaten me," he whispered. When Stambolov died, Ferdinand was conveniently away at the spa town of Carlsbad, taking the waters for his nerves. When the news reached him, he sent a telegram of public condolence, praising Stambolov's service. But privately, there is a persistent, chilling story that circulated in the courts of Europe for decades. It was said that the preserved hands of Stefan Stambolov were brought to the palace. It was said that Ferdinand kept them in a glass jar of formaldehyde in his private study for a time. Whether he kept them as a trophy of his victory or as a macabre reminder of the price of power, we will never know for sure. But the symbolism was clear. The hands that had held the prince down had been cut off. With Stambolov dead, the path was clear. Ferdinand turned his eyes north to Russia. The price of Russian friendship was the soul of his son. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia had made it clear. He would never recognize a Catholic dynasty in Bulgaria. If Ferdinand wanted the protection of the Russian bear, little Prince Boris had to become Orthodox. This was a personal agony for Ferdinand. He was terrified of the Pope. He was terrified of his wife, Marie-Louise, who was a devout Catholic and threatened to leave him if he converted their son. He was terrified of his own family in Austria, who saw Orthodoxy as a semi-pagan, schismatic faith. But Ferdinand was a politician first and a Catholic second. He weighed the soul of his son against the security of his throne. The throne won. In 1896, Ferdinand announced that Prince Boris would be converted to the Orthodox faith. The reaction was explosive. The Pope excommunicated Ferdinand. His wife, Marie-Louise, fled the country in tears, pregnant with their second child. She would eventually return, but the marriage was broken. The Catholic courts of Europe shunned him. But in St. Petersburg, the Tsar smiled. He agreed to be the godfather of the little prince. Diplomatic relations were restored. The great powers, Britain, France, Austria, finally recognized Ferdinand as the legitimate ruler of Bulgaria. He had betrayed his wife, his church, and his solemn promises. But he had won. He was no longer the vagabond prince. He was a recognized European sovereign. With his power consolidated, Ferdinand entered the 20th century as the absolute master of Bulgaria. And this is where the legend of Ferdinand truly begins to take shape. Free from Stambolov's oversight, Ferdinand unleashed his aesthetic passions on the country. He began a massive building program to transform Sofia from a Turkish village into a little Vienna. He imported yellow paving stones from Budapest to cover the muddy streets, stones that still pave the center of Sofia today. He built the National Theater, the Museum of Natural History, and the Royal Palace. He created the Royal Botanical Gardens, personally supervising the planting of thousands of rare orchids and alpine flowers. He had a team of entomologists whose sole job was to catch rare butterflies for his collection. But as his capital grew more beautiful, his personal reputation grew more bizarre. Ferdinand was a sight to behold. He was now in his 40s, his nose more prominent, his figure softening. He traveled Europe in his private train, the Ferdinand Express, which was decorated in blue velvet and gold leaf. He demanded to be treated with the pomp of a Byzantine emperor. He required his ministers to walk backwards out of his presence. He wore gloves at all times to avoid touching common objects. And then there were the whispers. Ferdinand's sexuality became the worst-kept secret in Europe. He did not have a stable male partner in the modern sense. Rather, he had a revolving door of handsome, blonde, blue-eyed aides-de-camp, whom he showered with gifts and promotions. He was known to disappear on incognito trips to the island of Capri, a known haven for wealthy homosexual men. In the masculine, militaristic culture of the early 1900s, this was dynamite. Foreign diplomats filled their cables with gossip. The French ambassador wrote catty letters about Ferdinand's perfumed whims. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II, a man who compensated for his own insecurities with hyperaggression, despised Ferdinand. He called him the flower. But Ferdinand didn't care, or at least he pretended not to. He weaponized his eccentricity. When diplomats came to see him to discuss war or treaties, he would force them to listen to a 2-hour lecture on the mating habits of the alpine beetle. He would distract them with his jewelry, play the fool, play the dandy, and then when their guard was down, he would extract exactly the concession he wanted. He was creating a persona, the unpredictable, eccentric, mysterious Tsar. It was a mask. Beneath the powder and the diamonds, he was studying maps. He was looking at the Ottoman Empire, which was crumbling like a rotten wall. He was looking at Macedonia, where Bulgarian rebels were fighting for freedom. He had built the state. He had secured the dynasty. Now he wanted glory. But glory required an army. And the man who hated the sight of blood was about to build the most efficient killing machine in the Balkans. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Prince of the Fleas had become the most fascinating monarch in Europe. Ferdinand I had defied the odds. He had survived the assassins. He had outlasted the dictators, and he had transformed Sofia from a mud brick village into a glittering miniature of Vienna, complete with electric trams, opera houses, and public gardens filled with his beloved roses. But Ferdinand was not satisfied. He was a man possessed by a ghost, the ghost of the Byzantine Empire. Deep in the recesses of his complex neurotic mind, Ferdinand did not see himself merely as the ruler of a small Balkan nation-state. He saw himself as the spiritual successor to the Caesars. He looked at the map and saw Constantinople, the jewel of the world, the city of Constantine, lying just a few hundred kilometers to the southeast, rotting in the hands of the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire. He began to dream a dangerous dream. He imagined himself riding a white horse through the Golden Gate of Constantinople. He imagined a mass in the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral turned mosque, cleansed and restored to Christendom under his scepter. He imagined a new Bulgarian empire that stretched from the Black Sea to the Aegean, a resurrected Byzantium, with himself as the Basileus, the emperor. To the cynical diplomats of London and Paris, this was the delusion of a madman. The Queen of the Balkans thinks she can be the Emperor of the East. They scoffed over their brandy. But they forgot one thing. Ferdinand was a madman who had built a very real, very dangerous army. While he fussed over the cut of his diamond-encrusted buttons, his generals were buying Mannlicher rifles from Austria and Krupp cannons from Germany. While he spent hours arranging his butterfly collection, his officers were drilling peasant boys into the most disciplined fighting force in southeastern Europe. The Prussia of the Balkans was being forged in silence, hidden behind the smokescreen of Ferdinand's eccentricities. The first step toward the dream was to shed the title of prince. A prince is a vassal. A prince bows. An emperor does not. In 1908, the Ottoman Empire was convulsed by the Young Turk Revolution. Chaos reigned in Constantinople. The fox saw his moment. He knew that the Ottomans were too distracted to stop him, and the great powers were too paralyzed to intervene. On October 5, 1908, Ferdinand boarded his royal train. But he didn't go to Sofia. He traveled to the ancient city of Veliko Tarnovo, the medieval capital of the Second Bulgarian Empire. It was a piece of theatrical mastery. He marched up the winding path to the ruins of the Tsarovets fortress, surrounded by ministers trembling in the autumn chill. Standing in the courtyard of the Holy 40 Martyrs Church, Ferdinand read a manifesto written in a script that deliberately mimicked ancient calligraphy. He declared Bulgaria fully independent from the Ottoman Empire, and then he dropped the bombshell. He did not declare himself king. He declared himself Tsar. The word sent a shockwave through Europe. Tsar comes from Caesar. It was a title that claimed equality with the Russian emperor and superiority over all other Balkan kings. It was a direct challenge to history. The Russian Tsar was annoyed. The British were amused. But the Bulgarian people were ecstatic. For 500 years, they had been slaves. Now they had a Caesar of their own. However, titles could not buy respect. In the eyes of the crowned heads of Europe, Ferdinand was still the foxy Coburg, the effeminate intriguer. And in 1909, this lack of respect manifested in an incident so physically humiliating that it likely pushed the world closer to war. Ferdinand was visiting Germany to meet with Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Kaiser was the antithesis of Ferdinand. Wilhelm was loud, boisterous, obsessed with manly vigor, and deeply insecure. He viewed Ferdinand's perfumes, his jewelry, and his mincing walk with aggressive disdain. During a reception at the Potsdam Palace, Ferdinand was standing by a window, admiring the view, his back to the room. The Kaiser, in a fit of bullying humor, crept up behind the Bulgarian Tsar and delivered a stinging, open-handed slap to Ferdinand's buttocks. The sound echoed through the hall. The German courtiers erupted in laughter. It was a prank among royals, they claimed. But for Ferdinand, it was a cataclysm. He turned slowly, his face drained of color, his eyes burning with a cold, reptilian fury. He was a czar. He was a grandson of a king of France, and he had been spanked in public like a naughty child. He did not shout. He did not fight back. He simply demanded his coat and left the palace immediately. He lodged a formal diplomatic protest. He threatened to cancel military contracts with Krupp. The Kaiser eventually offered a half-hearted apology, but the damage was done. Ferdinand never forgot. He never forgave. The humiliation festered in his soul, curdling into a deep hatred for the Germans, a hatred that makes his later alliance with them in World War I all the more tragic and cynical. He realized then that they would never respect him for who he was. They would only respect him for what he could destroy. Very well, he might have thought, nursing his wounded pride. If they treat me like a queen, I will show them how a queen makes war. By 1911, the Ottoman Empire in its death throes. Italy had attacked it in Libya, exposing its weakness. The vultures began to circle. But there was a problem. The Balkan nations, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro, hated each other almost as much as they hated the Turks. They squabbled over territory, over history, over whose version of Christianity was correct. The idea of them uniting was considered impossible. Enter Ferdinand, the diplomat. Swallowing his pride, Ferdinand reached out to Serbia. It was a bitter pill. Serbia was Bulgaria's rival for the soul of the Balkans. But Ferdinand knew he needed their manpower. Through secret channels, meeting in train cars and obscure spas, Ferdinand's diplomats wove a web of alliances. He promised the Serbs land in Macedonia. He promised the Greeks land in Thrace. He lied to everyone, of course. In his mind, once the Turks were gone, he would double-cross his allies and take the lion's share. But for now, he needed the Balkan League. In 1912, the trap was sprung. The Balkan League declared war on the Ottoman Empire. The First Balkan War had begun. The world held its breath. The newspapers in London and Berlin predicted a swift Ottoman victory. The Turks have 1 million men, the experts said. The Bulgarians are peasants led by a fop. They were wrong. The Bulgarian army that poured over the border in October 1912 was a revelation. It was not a ragtag militia. It was a machine. Ferdinand, displaying a surprising physical courage, went to the front. He didn't lead the charges. He still hated the sight of blood. but he established his headquarters near the lines. He wore a simple gray uniform, devoid of his usual jewelry. He watched through binoculars as his children, the peasant boys of Bulgaria, smashed into the Ottoman lines. The Battle of Kirk Kilis was the shock of the century. The Bulgarians, screaming "Na noj" on the knife, charged the Ottoman trenches with bayonets. The Turkish army, demoralized and disorganized, broke and ran. Ferdinand was ecstatic. "This is my vengeance," he cried. "This is the answer to Potsdam." The Bulgarian juggernaut rolled on. At the Battle of Lüleburgaz, the largest battle in Europe between the Napoleonic Wars and WWI, the Bulgarians shattered the main Ottoman army. The road to Constantinople was open. The Queen of the Balkans was now the conqueror of the Orient. The French newspapers, which had mocked his nose and his flowers for decades, now ran breathless headlines. "The miracle of the East. Ferdinand the Great." By November 1912, the Bulgarian army had reached the Chatalja line, the last line of defense before Constantinople. From the hilltops, the Bulgarian soldiers could see the minarets of the great city shimmering in the distance. They could smell the sea. Ferdinand was in a state of delirium. He began to prepare for his triumph. This is where the story reaches its peak of absurdity and pathos. Ferdinand secretly ordered a famous theatrical costumer in Paris to create a magnificent outfit for his entry into Constantinople. It was to be a replica of the robes of a Byzantine basileus, purple silk, gold embroidery, a chariot drawn by white horses. He planned to ride into the city, go to the Hagia Sophia, and have a mass sung declaring the cross triumphant over the crescent. He carried a baton of a marshal of the empire. He had a speech written. He was ready to end 500 years of history. But reality has a way of crushing dreams. The Bulgarian army was exhausted. They had outrun their supply lines. And a new silent enemy had appeared in the trenches. Cholera. Thousands of soldiers were dying, vomiting their lives away in the mud. The Ottoman defense at Chatalja was desperate and stiff. When Ferdinand ordered the final assault to take the city, his generals hesitated. They knew the men were breaking. But Ferdinand, blinded by the glitter of the Byzantine crown, insisted. "Attack," he ordered. "The city is right there." The attack failed. The Bulgarians were thrown back with heavy losses. The sick man of Europe had found one last burst of strength. Ferdinand stood on a hill, looking at the distant lights of Constantinople. He was so close. He could almost touch it, but he couldn't take it. The war ended with an armistice. The Ottoman Empire in Europe was effectively destroyed. The Balkan League had won a stunning victory, but in the moment of triumph, the rot set in. The peace conference in London was a disaster. The victors began to argue over the carcass of the Ottoman Turkey. Serbia, having been blocked by Austria from reaching the Adriatic Sea, demanded a larger chunk of Macedonia, territory that had been promised to Bulgaria. Greece, too, wanted more. Ferdinand felt cheated. He had fought the main Ottoman army. He had taken the heaviest casualties. And now, his allies, the Serbs and the Greeks, were trying to steal his prize. Paranoia, always Ferdinand's constant companion, took over. He felt the great powers were conspiring against him. He felt his generals were plotting. He retreated to his palace, pacing the halls, listening to the whisperings of the warmongers in his court. "We can beat them," the generals told him. "The Serbs are weak, the Greeks are lazy. One quick blow, and we can take it all. We can have Macedonia and Salonika." It was a siren song. A rational man would have taken what he had won. A massive expansion of territory, access to the Aegean Sea, and international prestige. A rational man would have consolidated his gains. But Ferdinand was no longer rational. He was the Tsar who had almost been emperor. The Byzantine ghost was screaming in his ear. He didn't want a piece of the cake. He wanted the whole bakery. And so in the summer of 1913, Ferdinand I of Bulgaria made the decision that would turn his golden triumph into a pile of ash. He decided to roll the dice one last time. He didn't know it yet, but the fox was about to walk straight into a bear trap. History is often written as a series of inevitable events, a flowing river where one thing leads logically to another. But sometimes, history hinges on a single moment of catastrophic stupidity, a decision so reckless, so blinded by ego, that it defies all rational explanation. For Ferdinand I of Bulgaria, and for the nation he ruled, that moment came on the night of June 16th, 1913. The First Balkan War was over. The Ottoman Empire had been crushed. Bulgaria was triumphant, possessing the largest army in the Balkans and a reputation that terrified its neighbors. Ferdinand was the conqueror of the Orient. He had won, but he couldn't stop winning. He looked at the map of Macedonia, that jagged mountainous land of mixed ethnicities, and saw that his allies, Serbia and Greece, were occupying territories that he believed belonged to him by right of treaty. The Byzantine ghost in his head was whispering that he was being robbed. His generals, drunk on their own recent victories, assured him that the Bulgarian army was invincible. "We can brush the Serbs aside with one hand," they boasted. "We can take Salonika from the Greeks in a week." In the suffocating heat of that June night, Ferdinand made the decision that would earn him the title of the grave digger of his own people. Without a formal declaration of war, without warning his own cabinet ministers, and without informing his Russian patrons, he ordered his army to attack his former allies. It was intended to be a swift police action, a sharp slap to remind the inferior Serbs and Greeks who was the master of the Balkans. Instead, it was an act of national suicide. The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. The moment the first Bulgarian shot was fired, the trap snapped shut. Serbia and Greece had been expecting this. They had formed a secret pact against Bulgaria months earlier. Their armies, hardened and prepared, did not break. They fought back with a ferocity that stunned the Bulgarian commanders. But the real nightmare was happening behind the lines. Ferdinand had stripped his northern and southern borders to throw everything at the Serbs. He had left the back door of his house unlocked. Romania, Bulgaria's northern neighbor, saw an undefended border and a chance for free land. The Romanian army crossed the Danube unopposed. They didn't even have to fight. They simply marched. Within weeks, Romanian cavalry patrols were spotted just a few miles from Sofia. Ferdinand could look out of his palace window and practically see the enemy approaching. Then from the south, the corpse rose from the grave. The Ottoman Empire, seeing its conqueror distracted, surged back into Europe. The Turks marched into eastern Thrace, reclaiming the city of Adrianople, the very city Ferdinand had spent thousands of lives to capture just months before. They took it back without firing a shot because there were no Bulgarian soldiers left to defend it. Bulgaria was surrounded. It was a wolf pack attack. Greece, Serbia, Romania, the Ottoman Empire, everyone was taking a bite out of the dying state. Panic swept through Sofia. The invincible army was crumbling. Cholera was rampant. The hospitals were overflowing with men broken not by glory, but by betrayal. Ferdinand, the warlord, collapsed into a state of nervous prostration. He locked himself in his rooms, refusing to see ministers, weeping and blaming everyone but himself. "My generals lied to me," he screamed. "The Russians abandoned me." On August 10, 1913, the humiliation was formalized with the Treaty of Bucharest. It was a butchery. Bulgaria lost almost all the territory it had won in the First Balkan War. It lost the fertile Dobruja region to Romania. It lost most of Macedonia to Serbia, and Greece, Ferdinand had gambled an empire and lost a kingdom. The Bulgarian people who had cheered him as a messiah a year earlier now spat when they heard his name. They called it the first national catastrophe. Most monarchs would have abdicated in shame. A man with a shred of honor might have stepped down to save the country from the hatred he had engendered. But Ferdinand was not a man of honor. He was a Coburg. He possessed a survival instinct that was almost cockroach-like in its resilience. He did not leave. Instead, he stewed. He sat in his palace, surrounded by his jewels and his butterflies, and nursed a cold black coal of hatred in his heart. He hated the Serbs, who stole his Macedonia. He hated the Russians, who had failed to protect him. He hated the Romanians. He hated the world. "My vengeance will be terrible," he whispered to his few remaining confidants. For 2 years, from 1913 to 1915, Bulgaria sat on the sidelines as the rest of Europe plunged into the abyss of World War I. The Great War was a meat grinder, consuming millions of lives in France and Russia. But in the Balkans, there was an eerie silence. Both the Allied powers, Britain, France, Russia, and the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, looked at the map and realized that Bulgaria was the key. Geographically, it sat right in the middle. If Bulgaria joined the Allies, they could link up with Russia and crush the Turks. If Bulgaria joined the Germans, they could crush Serbia and link up with the Ottoman Empire. Ferdinand became the most courted girl at the dance. It was a surreal situation. The same British diplomats who had mocked him as a fop were now arriving in Sofia with promises of loans and territory. The German Kaiser, who had slapped his bottom, sent him solid gold-field martial batons and flattering letters. Ferdinand enjoyed it immensely. He played the fox once again. He negotiated with both sides simultaneously. He would have breakfast with the British ambassador and dinner with the German envoy. He put Bulgaria up for auction to the highest bidder. The Allies had a problem. They were friends with Serbia. They couldn't offer Ferdinand the one thing he wanted, Macedonia, because Serbia, their ally, already owned it. The Germans had no such scruples. "Join us," Berlin whispered, "and you can have it all. You can have Macedonia. You can have parts of Serbia. You can take whatever you want. We will give you the sword to cut the throat of the Serbs." It was a deal with the devil. Ferdinand despised the Germans personally. He was a Francophile who spoke better French than German. He knew that Germany viewed him with contempt, but his hatred for Serbia was stronger than his pride. In the autumn of 1915, Ferdinand made his choice. He signed a secret treaty with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but there was one man brave enough to stand in his way. Alexander Stamboliski was the leader of the Bulgarian Agrarian Union. He was a giant of a man, a peasant populist with a booming voice and a fierce love for his country. He represented the 80% of Bulgarians who were farmers, the men who would actually have to die in Ferdinand's war. Ferdinand summoned the opposition leaders to the palace to inform them of his decision. The meeting was electric. Stamboliski stood up, towering over the Tsar. He looked Ferdinand in the eye, something few dared to do, and delivered a prophecy. "Your Highness," Stamboliski thundered, "this policy will lead to the ruin of the country. If you lead us into war on the side of Germany, you will not only lose your throne, but you may lose your head." Ferdinand turned pale. He was terrified of physical threats. "Do not worry about my head," he snapped, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and arrogance. "I am old. Worry about your own." He had Stamboliski thrown in prison that very day. The last voice of reason was silenced. The order for mobilization was signed. The second national catastrophe had begun. At first it looked like Ferdinand was a genius. In October 1915, the Bulgarian army struck Serbia from the rear, while the Germans and Austrians attacked from the north. It was a slaughter. The Serbian army, caught in a vice, was crushed. They retreated over the freezing mountains of Albania in one of the most horrific treks in military history. Ferdinand's troops marched into Macedonia. They marched into Niš. They occupied almost all of Serbia. Ferdinand traveled to the captured Serbian city of Niš. He stood on the balcony of the town hall looking down at the defeated populace. This was his moment. The revenge of 1913 was complete. He held a banquet where he toasted the destruction of the serpent. He sent telegrams to the Kaiser, boasting of his triumph. For a brief, shining moment, Ferdinand was the master of the Balkans again. He had regained all the lost territories. The map of Bulgaria was bloated and vast. But wars are not won in the first year. By 1916, the front stabilized. The remnants of the Serbian army, rescued by Allied ships, regrouped in Greece. The British and French landed a massive expeditionary force in Salonika. A new front opened up, the Salonika Front. It was a stalemate of hellish proportions. The Bulgarian army was dug in on the mountain peaks, looking down at the Allies in the valleys. For 3 years, they held the line. It was a remarkable feat of endurance. But while the Allies were rotated and resupplied, the Bulgarians were left to rot. By 1918, Bulgaria was a ghost country. The economy had collapsed. There were no men left in the fields, only women and old men trying to scratch a living from the earth. Food was scarce. In the cities, people were eating bread made of corn stalks and straw. On the front lines, the soldiers, Ferdinand's children, were in rags. They had no boots. They wrapped their feet in raw sheepskin. Their uniforms were falling apart. They were starving, riddled with lice and malaria. And they were angry. They received letters from home telling them that their children were starving while German officers in Sofia were buying up all the food and sending it to Berlin. They heard rumors that Ferdinand was safe in his palace, eating French delicacies and polishing his jewels. The Tsar of the Bulgarians had become a phantom. He rarely visited the front anymore. He couldn't bear to look into the eyes of the men he had sent to die. He stayed in his palaces, obsessed with his safety, terrified of assassination. He knew the ice was cracking under his feet. He bombarded his German allies with desperate telegrams. Send food, send boots, send reinforcements. But Germany, bleeding to death on the Western Front, had nothing to give. They had used Bulgaria to crush Serbia, and now they were letting Bulgaria wither on the vine. The end came in September 1918. The Allied forces on the Salonika Front launched a massive offensive at Dobropol. They slammed into the Bulgarian lines with overwhelming artillery and air power. The Bulgarian soldiers fought bravely for a day or two, but then something snapped. It wasn't cowardice, it was exhaustion. They had fought for 6 years, since 1912, almost without a break. They had simply had enough. The front collapsed, but the soldiers didn't just surrender. They turned around. They picked up their rifles and started marching. Not away from the enemy, but back home, toward Sofia. It was a rebellion. The radical agrarian soldiers, inspired by the Russian Revolution that had happened just a year earlier, declared that they were going to hang the Tsar and proclaim a republic. They released Stamboliski from prison and declared him their leader. Ferdinand watched the reports coming in with horror. A column of angry, armed deserters was marching on his capital. The Germans were losing the war. His allies were collapsing. He had one card left to play. He had to save the dynasty. If he stayed, the mob would kill him and his family, and Bulgaria would become a republic or a communist state. If he left, perhaps his son could save the throne. On the evening of October 3rd, 1918, a somber meeting took place in the Vrana Palace. Ferdinand, dressed not in a uniform but in a simple traveling suit, stood before his ministers. He looked aged, his face gray and drawn. The fox had no more tricks. He signed the instrument of abdication. He did it with a strange, icy calm. He handed the pen to his son, the 24-year-old Crown Prince Boris. Boris was weeping. He was a gentle, popular young man who had spent the war at the front with the soldiers. He was inheriting a ruined country, a defeated army, and a legacy of hatred. "I leave you a crown of thorns," Ferdinand reportedly told his son. "Wear it better than I did." A few hours later, a train pulled into the private station at the palace. It was the same train, the Ferdinand Express, that had carried him around Europe in his days of glory. Now it was a hearse for his ambitions. Ferdinand walked to the platform. He didn't look back at the palace he had built or the gardens he had planted. He boarded the train with his daughters and his personal staff. As the steam engine hissed and the wheels began to turn, taking him away from Sofia and toward the Austrian border, Ferdinand I of Bulgaria ceased to exist. He was just an old man named Ferdinand Coburg, a refugee with a lot of luggage and nowhere to call home. He would never set foot in Bulgaria again. He would never see his son again as Tsar. He left behind 150,000 dead soldiers, a country stripped of territory, and a people who would curse his name for generations. The curtain had fallen on the tragedy of the king. But the strange, quiet afterlife of the botanist was just beginning. The train that carried Ferdinand into exile did not stop at a border. It stopped in a different reality. When he stepped onto the platform in Coburg, Germany, the Tsar of the Bulgarians effectively ceased to exist. The uniforms, the medals, the saluting guards, the terrified ministers, they all vanished like smoke in a strong wind. In their place remained an aging, bitter man in a tweed suit, clutching a walking stick and shivering in the damp German autumn. He was 57 years old. Most men of his era and station would have faded into a quiet, gin-soaked obscurity, haunting the casinos of Monte Carlo or the spas of Baden-Baden. But Ferdinand was not most men. He was a creature of immense, restless energy. If he could not rule a kingdom of men, he would rule a kingdom of nature. He moved into the Augustin Palais in Coburg, a family property. It was comfortable, but compared to the palaces he had built in Sofia, it was modest. The townspeople of Coburg watched him with suspicion. To them, he was a failed monarch, a man who had bet on the wrong horse and lost. They called him the broken Tsar. But Ferdinand did not behave like a broken man. He behaved like a man who had finally been allowed to take off a tight, uncomfortable mask. Almost immediately, Ferdinand threw himself into his old passions, botany and ornithology. This was not the hobby of a bored retiree. It was the obsession of a scientist. He converted large sections of his residence into a museum. He hired secretaries to catalog his massive collections of insects and plants, which he had managed to smuggle out of Bulgaria. He traveled. No longer the foxy Ferdinand of diplomatic intrigue, he became Professor Coburg. He went on scientific expeditions to South America, to East Africa, and to the Nile. He wasn't hunting lions, he was hunting rare butterflies. He discovered new species. He wrote papers. He corresponded with the leading scientists of Europe, who were often surprised to find that the man writing to them about the mating habits of the African weaver bird was the former warlord of the Balkans. In Coburg, he became a local legend, a Wizard of Oz figure. He was rarely seen in town, but when he was, it was a spectacle. He would be driven in a large, open Mercedes wrapped in furs, his nose pointing imperiously at the horizon. He demanded that the local police stop traffic for him, even though he had no official authority. He was difficult, arrogant, and often cruel to his staff, but he was also finding a strange kind of peace. "I have always preferred the company of animals to humans," he once remarked. "Animals do not lie, and they do not ask for constitutions." But he could not completely detach himself from Bulgaria. His son, Boris III, was now the Tsar. The relationship between Ferdinand and Boris was complex and tragic. Boris was everything Ferdinand was not: humble, approachable, and genuinely loved by the people. Boris drove his own train engines, walked the streets of Sofia without guards, and ate with peasants. He was cleaning up the mess his father had left behind. Ferdinand watched from afar, a mix of pride and jealousy gnawing at him. He was proud that the dynasty had survived, but he was jealous that his son was succeeding where he had failed. He bombarded Boris with letters, long rambling missives filled with unsolicited advice. "Do not trust the British," he would write. "Watch the army. Be firmer with the ministers." Boris, a dutiful son, read them all but rarely acted on them. He visited his father in Coburg occasionally. These meetings were tense. Ferdinand would critique Boris's clothes, his policies, his choice of wife. Boris married the daughter of the King of Italy. Ferdinand was the eternal critic, the King Lear, who couldn't stop shouting at the storm. Yet despite the friction, they were the only two people on earth who understood the burden of the Bulgarian crown, the crown of thorns. As the 1930s progressed, a new shadow fell over Europe: the rise of Adolf Hitler. Ferdinand's position was awkward. He was a German prince living in Germany. He had to coexist with the Nazis. His attitude toward Hitler was a fascinating study in aristocratic snobbery. Ferdinand was an old-school autocrat. He believed in the divine right of kings, in lineage and refinement. He viewed Hitler as a vulgar, screaming corporal, a man with no taste and no breeding. "He eats like a peasant and shouts like a drunkard," Ferdinand reportedly sneered in private. However, Ferdinand also admired power. When Hitler began to tear up the Treaty of Versailles and restore German military might, Ferdinand watched with approval. He saw in the Nazis a force that could avenge the humiliations of World War I. He attended the Bayreuth Festival with Hitler sitting in the royal box. Photographs from the time show the two men together: the aging, elegant Tsar with his white beard and jeweled rings, and the stiff, uniformed dictator. It was a meeting of two different eras of tyranny, but Ferdinand kept his distance. He refused to join the Nazi Party. He maintained his identity as a European monarch, above the squalid politics of the day. World War II dragged Bulgaria back into the fire. Boris III tried desperately to keep his country neutral. He remembered his father's mistakes. He remembered the national catastrophes. But history has a cruel way of repeating itself. Under immense pressure from Hitler, Bulgaria joined the Axis in 1941. But Boris managed a feat his father never could. He refused to declare war on Russia, and he refused to deport the Bulgarian Jews to the death camps. Boris walked a tightrope over a volcano. In August 1943, Hitler summoned Boris to the Wolf's Lair. The meeting was stormy. Hitler screamed, demanding that Bulgaria send troops to the Eastern Front. Boris refused. Days after returning to Sofia, Boris III collapsed. He died on August 28, 1943, at the age of 49. The official cause was heart failure, but rumors of poison by the Nazis, or perhaps the Soviets, swirled immediately. When the news reached Coburg, Ferdinand was shattered. The old fox broke down. His son, the boy he had forced to convert, the man he had bullied and envied, was dead. "I have outlived everything," Ferdinand wept. "My glory, my kingdom, and now my son. Why does God not take me?" He didn't go to the funeral. The war made travel impossible. He sat alone in his museum, surrounded by dead things, while his dynasty began to crumble. With Boris dead, the throne passed to his 6-year-old son, Simeon II. A regency council was formed, led by Ferdinand's other son, Prince Kirill. It was a doom-laden arrangement. In 1944, the Soviet Red Army swept into the Balkans. Bulgaria switched sides, but it was too late. The communists seized power. The vengeance of the People's Court was swift and barbaric. On the night of February 1st, 1945, Prince Kirill, along with the former prime minister and hundreds of other officials, was taken to a bomb crater in a Sofia cemetery. They were lined up and shot one by one. Their bodies were dumped into a mass grave. Ferdinand heard the news in Coburg. First Boris, now Kirill. His life's work, the establishment of the Coburg dynasty in the East, had been literally lined up against a wall and shot. He fell into a deep depression. He stopped traveling. He stopped writing papers. He became a ghost in his own home. He was 84 years old, crippled by gout and heart trouble. He spent his days in a wheelchair, staring out the window at the gray German sky, wrapped in a blanket that bore the royal crest of a country that no longer existed. In his final years, Ferdinand became obsessed with one thought: his burial. He knew he was dying. He knew he would not be welcome in communist Bulgaria, but he refused to accept it. "I must rest in the Bulgarian earth," he told his aides repeatedly. "I have given my life to that ungrateful land. My wife is buried there. My son is buried there. I must go back." He commissioned a simple purple sarcophagus. He left detailed instructions. If his body could not be taken to Sofia, it was to be kept in a temporary crypt until the day he could return. On September 10th, 1948, Ferdinand I of Bulgaria died in his sleep in Coburg. He was 87 years old. He was the last surviving major leader of World War I. The Kaiser was dead. Emperor Franz Joseph was dead. Tsar Nicholas was dead. Ferdinand had outlived them all, a lonely relic of a vanished world. His funeral was a small affair. There were no state honors, no gun salutes, just a few family members and loyal servants. His coffin was placed in the crypt of St. Augustine's Church in Coburg, next to his parents. "Temporary," the priest said, but the Iron Curtain had descended. The temporary stay would last for 76 years. Decades rolled by. The Berlin Wall rose and fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. Bulgaria became a democracy. Ferdinand's grandson Simeon II, the boy king who was exiled in 1946, returned to Bulgaria in a stunning twist of history and was elected prime minister in 2001, the only monarch in history to regain political power through democratic election. Yet Ferdinand remained in Coburg. He was the forgotten Tsar, a controversial figure that modern Bulgaria didn't know how to handle. Was he a villain? A hero? Finally, in 2024, the stars aligned. The Bulgarian government, the Holy Synod of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, and the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha family reached an agreement. The old fox could come home. On May 29, 2024, a German military plane touched down at Sofia Airport. A hearse, draped in the royal standard, carried the purple sarcophagus through the streets Ferdinand had paved, past the buildings he had built. He was not taken to the royal palace. He was taken to the Vrana Palace on the outskirts of Sofia. His favorite residence, the place where he had spent his happiest hours gardening, the place from which he had fled in 1918. There were no massive crowds of cheering peasants this time, but there was dignity. The coffin was carried by guards in 19th century uniforms. His grandson, Simeon II, now an old man himself, stood weeping as his grandfather finally returned. Ferdinand was laid to rest in the family crypt at Vrana. The soil he had yearned for finally covered him. So how do we judge Ferdinand I of Bulgaria? It is easy to dismiss him as a caricature, the Queen, the dandy, the disastrous warlord. It is easy to point to the thousands of dead soldiers and say he was a monster. But history is rarely that simple. Ferdinand was a man of immense vision who lacked the restraint to realize it. He found a country of mud and wooden shacks and left it a nation of railways, universities, and European architecture. He gave Bulgaria its modern identity, even as he nearly destroyed it with his ambition. He was a man born in the wrong body, in the wrong family, and in the wrong time. He was a scientist forced to be a soldier, an aesthete forced to be a dictator, a man who loved men forced to play the patriarch. Perhaps the true tragedy of Ferdinand is not that he failed, but that he was so alone. He was too German for the Bulgarians, too Balkan for the Europeans, too effeminate for the soldiers, and too sharp for the diplomats. He lived his life behind a wall of diamonds and irony, terrified that if he ever let anyone see the real man, the frightened, sensitive boy who just wanted to catch butterflies, they would destroy him. In the end, he remains the Orchid Emperor, a figure of exotic, poisonous beauty, blooming brilliantly and tragically in the blood-soaked soil of the Balkans. And now, at last, the fox sleeps.